An elderly man adopts a dog, until one day the dog runs away, leading to a shocking discovery that leaves him pale and speechless. Santiago was an elderly man, the kind who spent his days gazing out the window, watching life pass by without much hurry. Ever since he lost his wife and only son, his house had become too big, too quiet. The loneliness pressed heavily on his chest, and on some days it felt like the silence had more presence than he did. One day, someone suggested, "Why don't you adopt a dog? It's good to have a friend around." Santiago wasn't too keen on the idea but eventually agreed. He visited a shelter, and among many dogs, he saw Thor, a large, strong dog with a serious look, seemingly carrying a story in his heart. Thor was a retired racing dog, no longer young, and no one wanted to adopt him. Santiago looked at Thor and felt something different. "This is my dog," he thought. Without fully understanding why, he signed the adoption papers and brought Thor home. At first, their relationship was a bit awkward, like two strangers trying to figure out how they could help each other. Thor, full of energy and always restless, wasn't the calm, homely dog Santiago had envisioned. Thor ran around the house, sniffing corners as if searching for something. Santiago, with his slower pace, would watch, sometimes amused, sometimes wondering if he had made the right choice. But then, something curious happened. On their first walk together, Thor pulled at the leash as if he wanted to sprint, while Santiago, moving more slowly, had to say, "Take it easy, boy. Go at my pace." At first, Thor ignored him, but after a few days, he started looking back, as if to make sure Santiago was keeping up. It was a small gesture, but for Santiago, it was special, as if Thor were saying, "All right, I'll wait for you." Over time, their routines started to fall into place. Every morning, Thor was already by the door, wagging his tail, waiting to go out. Santiago would grab the leash, look at Thor, and say, "Let's go, partner." It gave him a reason to get out of bed, step outside, and breathe some fresh air. Thor seemed to understand how important that was. What surprised Santiago the most was how Thor seemed to sense his emotions. On days when the longing for his wife and son became overwhelming, Santiago would sit in his armchair, staring into the void. Thor would quietly approach, rest his head on Santiago's lap, and just stay there in silence. No words were needed, just presence. It was as if Thor knew Santiago needed that comfort. Little by little, the two grew more alike. Santiago became more active thanks to Thor, while Thor seemed calmer when near his owner. They were no longer just an elderly man and a dog, they were friends, a duo that completed each other. Without Santiago even noticing, the loneliness that once filled his house began to fade. Thor was doing more than just being a dog, he was bringing life back to Santiago's heart. Life seemed to be going well for Santiago and Thor. Their mornings were marked by peaceful walks and their afternoons by quiet companionship in the living room. But life has a way of testing us, and a storm was brewing on the horizon. One late afternoon, the once blue sky darkened quickly. Santiago looked out the window and saw storm clouds gathering fast, as if warning of something big. He called Thor inside, saying, "Today's walk will have to wait, buddy." But Thor, restless, paced back and forth near the door, as if sensing something was wrong. Soon, the first thunderclaps cracked across the sky. Santiago didn't like storms, but Thor seemed to hate them even more. He began barking at the thunder and scratching at the door, as if desperate to get out. "Calm down, Thor, it's just rain." "It'll pass," Santiago said, trying to soothe him. But Thor wasn't listening. He seemed more agitated by the minute. Then came a thunderclap so loud it rattled the windows. Distracted, Santiago left the door slightly ajar while checking the windows in the living room. That's when it happened. With a swift push of his nose, Thor forced the door open and bolted into the yard. "Thor, come back!" Santiago shouted, but the dog was already disappearing into the storm's darkness. Santiago ran after him, but the rain was heavy and Thor was too fast. He called out, but the storm drowned out his voice. Water pooled on the streets, and Santiago, struggling with his age, could barely see where he was going. Still, he pressed on. The fear of losing Thor gripped his heart in a way he hadn't felt in years. After a while, Santiago realized he was soaked, shivering with cold, and had no sign of Thor. He returned home, heavy-hearted. Closing the door, he looked at the emptiness around him and murmured, "Please, God, bring my friend back." The house, which had felt alive with Thor's presence, now felt emptier than ever. That night, Santiago barely slept. Every rumble of thunder made him get up, hoping to hear Thor returning, but all he heard was the rain pounding on the roof. The storm passed, but the emptiness inside him felt as vast as the silence that filled the house. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you love animals and enjoy hearing heartwarming stories. The days after the storm were a true test for Santiago. The house, which had once seemed to come alive with Thor, returned to being the empty, silent place it was before. Every corner seemed to hold a trace of the dog's presence. The spot where he curled up to sleep, the food bowl now untouched, and even the leash hanging on the wall, as if waiting for Thor for another walk. Santiago couldn't accept what had happened. How did I let him escape? I should have held the door better. These thoughts hammered in his mind, adding even more weight to his grief. The guilt mixed with longing made each day feel longer and harder. In the early days, Santiago still had hope. He roamed the neighborhood with a flashlight and umbrella, calling for Thor just as he would at home. "Thor, where are you, buddy?" he called out loudly, his voice cracking as he fought back tears. Santiago searched the streets they used to walk together, looked in alleys, parks, and even asked neighbors for help. But no one had seen Thor. Gradually, reality began to sink in. Thor wasn't just a dog to Santiago, he was the only companion that pulled him out of his loneliness. Now, with Thor gone, the old pain, the loss of his wife and son, seemed to return even stronger. It felt as if Santiago had been left all alone again, with no one to share his days. The nights were the hardest. Before, Thor would lie down near Santiago's armchair, softly snoring while the old man watched TV. Now, the silence was almost unbearable. Santiago tried to keep his mind occupied, but everything reminded him of Thor. He would glance at the door, hoping to hear the sound of paws on the floor, but all that came was emptiness. Days turned into weeks, and as time passed, the hope of finding Thor began to fade. Santiago felt old and tired, as if each search attempt drained more of his energy. He still kept Thor's food bowl full, just in case, but he was no longer sure it would ever be needed again. One afternoon, as he gazed out the window, Santiago let out a long sigh and murmured to himself, "I don't think he's coming back." It was as if, for the first time, he was admitting he had lost Thor. The pain of that realization was almost physical, like something inside him had broken. Despite everything, a small part of Santiago refused to completely give up. He still glanced at the door whenever he heard a noise. Deep down, he knew Thor wasn't just a dog. Thor had been the spark that reignited something within him. And no matter how much Santiago tried to convince himself otherwise, he still held on to a sliver of hope that maybe the unexpected could happen. Then, one morning, everything changed. It started as a day like any other, with Santiago still adjusting to the house's silence. He was sitting in his armchair, staring at Thor's food bowl, which he stubbornly kept full. He didn't know exactly why he kept doing it. Perhaps it was habit, or maybe it was the faint glimmer of hope he carried, even if he wouldn't admit it. Suddenly, a faint sound came from the door. Santiago barely noticed it at first. Probably the wind, he thought. But then it came again, louder, the unmistakable sound of something scratching at the wood. Santiago's heart raced. He stood up so quickly he nearly knocked over the cane he used for support. When he opened the door, there he was, Thor. Thor looked completely different. His fur was wet and caked with mud, and he appeared exhausted, as if he'd been running for days. But Thor's eyes sparkled in a way Santiago had never seen before. It was as if the dog was saying, "I'm back, but I've brought something important." Santiago knelt in front of Thor, despite the difficulty, and hugged the dog tightly. "You came back, boy. You came back." Tears streamed down Santiago's face, but this time they weren't just of sadness, they were of relief and joy. He had lost so much in life that, in that moment, feeling Thor there again was like recovering a piece of what he thought was gone forever. But then Santiago noticed something strange. Thor hadn't returned empty-handed or empty-pawed. He was carrying something between his teeth. At first, Santiago thought it was just a stick or some piece of trash Thor had picked up. But when the dog dropped the object at his feet, Santiago froze. It was a collar. An old, rusty collar with a worn-out tag. Santiago picked up the collar with trembling hands. He recognized it. There was no mistaking it. He turned the tag over and read the engraved name. Maximum. Santiago's heart nearly stopped. Max had been his son's dog, the same dog that went missing years ago, shortly after the accident that took his only son's life. How was this possible? How could Thor, a dog who had never known Max, have found that collar? And why had he brought it back? Santiago stared at the collar, trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. Thor, on the other hand, seemed calm. He wagged his tail slowly, as if to say, "Trust me. I knew this was important." Santiago sat on the front steps with Thor by his side, holding the collar like it was a lost piece of the past. Emotion overwhelmed him. It felt as if, somehow, his son was sending a message. But what? Why? He didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear: Thor hadn't just come home. He had returned to guide Santiago towards something greater, something he couldn't yet understand. Santiago couldn't take his eyes off the collar. Each time he read the name Max engraved on the tag, memories of his son and the dog that followed him everywhere flooded his mind. He remembered his boys' laughter, the afternoons they spent playing in the yard, and Max's unwavering loyalty, always by his son's side like a faithful shadow. Then came the day when everything fell apart. First, the accident that took his son's life, and then Max's disappearance, as if the dog couldn't go on without his owner. Now, years later, that collar was in his hands. It was impossible not to feel a mix of hope and confusion. How had Thor found something that had been lost for so long? And why had he decided to bring it to Santiago? Thor, sitting beside Santiago, seemed restless. He looked toward the horizon, as if wanting to say something but unable to. Santiago, in turn, felt he couldn't ignore what was happening. Something about the situation felt too significant to be mere coincidence. "Thor, what do you want to show me?" Santiago asked, more to himself than to the dog. Thor wagged his tail slightly, but his steady gaze at Santiago made one thing clear: "Follow me." Santiago slowly got up, leaning on his cane, and decided to do just that: follow Thor. He grabbed a jacket, tucked the collar into his pocket, and opened the door. "All right, boy, show me where you found this." Thor darted ahead, not with the playful energy of a dog having fun, but with the determination of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. They walked through streets and alleys, passing places Santiago and Thor had never visited before. Each step seemed to draw Santiago deeper into a sense of mystery. Thor moved with his nose close to the ground, sniffing and checking every corner as if confirming the path. Despite his exhaustion, Santiago didn't consider stopping. Something within him urged him to keep going. After what felt like hours, Thor suddenly stopped. They were in front of an area surrounded by trees and dense vegetation. Santiago looked around, confused. There didn't seem to be anything important there, just an abandoned lot. "Is this it?" he asked, but Thor had already ventured onto a trail, with Santiago following closely behind. As they advanced, the scenery began to change. Santiago started noticing signs of something unusual. Piles of wood, rusted signs on the ground, and, farther ahead, what looked like an improvised shelter. He paused for a moment, taking in the scene, trying to understand its significance. Thor, however, didn't stop. He continued until he reached the entrance of the shelter and barked, as if calling Santiago's attention. The old man's heart pounded in his chest. He felt there was something important there, something he needed to uncover. Santiago took a deep breath and stepped forward, unaware that he was about to face a revelation that would change everything. Santiago took the last steps toward the improvised shelter, each movement filled with a mix of anxiety and curiosity. The place seemed forgotten by time. Its walls were made of old, poorly fitted planks with gaps that let the wind through. A small crooked sign hung at the entrance, with faded letters that appeared to spell refuge. Santiago clutched Max's collar in his pocket as Thor, by his side, seemed more determined than ever. Before we continue this story, tell us in the comments below if you have a pet and share a story about them. Before Santiago could enter, he heard voices coming from inside. They were soft, almost like whispers, but didn't sound threatening. Thor barked lightly, drawing attention. A woman appeared at the door, wearing an apron stained with dirt and with a look of both weariness and relief upon seeing Thor. "Ah, so he found his way back," she said, more to herself than to Santiago. "Thor was here?" Santiago asked, his voice thick with emotion and confusion. The woman nodded and introduced herself as Clara, a volunteer who helped care for abandoned animals at the shelter. She explained that Thor had arrived there 2 days earlier, exhausted and carrying the same collar that was now in Santiago's pocket. He had seemed determined to show them something but disappeared before anyone could understand. Santiago was even more intrigued. "This collar, it belonged to my son's dog. How is that possible? Where did Thor find it?" Clara shook her head, equally puzzled. "I don't know, sir, but perhaps you should come inside. There's something here you need to see." Inside, Santiago was greeted by a simple yet welcoming environment. Wooden crates housed rescued animals, and mattresses were scattered across the floor for the dogs and cats with nowhere else to go. The place was humble but gave off a feeling that those there truly cared. Clara led him to a corner of the shelter, where a small blanket lay folded on an old mattress. "We found a boy near here in the woods, alone. He was clutching this collar when we found him. He said he was following a large dog, but by the time we found him, the dog had already disappeared." A chill ran down Santiago's spine. "A boy? With Max's collar? How could this all be connected?" Before he could respond, Clara gently called out, "Come, he's resting here." When Santiago saw the boy for the first time, something inside him froze. The child was wrapped in the blanket, his face tired, but his eyes carried something familiar, something Santiago couldn't explain. The boy slowly woke up and looked at Santiago without saying a word. There was an inexplicable connection in that moment. Thor, sitting beside them, seemed to be watching everything closely, as if waiting for the next step. Santiago knelt slowly, looking the boy in the eye. "Are you all right, son? What happened to you?" The boy hesitated but then pointed to Thor. "It was him. He brought me here. He saved me." Santiago looked at Thor, who wagged his tail as if to say, "I knew what I was doing." It was a lot to process, but Santiago felt that destiny had led him to this moment. He still didn't understand how everything was connected, but he knew Thor wasn't just an ordinary dog. Thor had guided Santiago there for a greater purpose. Santiago sat beside the boy, still trying to piece together the puzzle. He couldn't take his eyes off the child, who seemed so fragile, so scared, yet with something in his eyes that tugged at Santiago's heart. Thor, sensing it was time to let things unfold, lay quietly beside them, watchful but calm. Clara explained that the boy had been found by other shelter volunteers 2 days earlier in a forested area not far from there. He was alone, wearing dirty and torn clothes, clutching the collar as if it were a treasure. "He didn't say much," Clara explained. "Only that he was following a big dog. We thought he was making it up, but now, with Thor here, it all makes more sense." Santiago looked at the collar in his hands and then at the boy. "Kid, where did you find this?" he asked, his voice gentle but filled with curiosity. The boy looked at Thor before answering, as if seeking permission. Then he spoke softly, "He showed me. The big dog. He took me there." Santiago frowned, confused. "Took you where, son?" The boy explained, hesitantly and with pauses, that he had been lost in the forest for days. He couldn't recall exactly how he got there but remembered being scared, alone, and unsure of where to go. That's when Thor appeared, or at least a dog he believed was Thor. "He didn't leave me alone," the boy continued, his voice a bit steadier. "He led me to a fallen tree where something shiny was on the ground. It was this collar." The boy squinted, trying to recall the details. "After that, he guided me here. And when I got here, he left." Santiago felt like he was hearing something impossible. How could Thor have helped the boy and also brought the collar back to him? It was as if the dog had been in 2 places at once. But, strange as it seemed, the boy's story carried a weight Santiago couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Clara joined the conversation. "Of course, We contacted the authorities. We tried to find his family, but he doesn't remember much. He's confused. Poor thing. All we know is that he needed help and that, somehow, this dog here," she glanced at Thor, "is part of it." Santiago ran his hand over his face, trying to absorb everything. He looked at Thor, who was now lying calmly but with that knowing gaze that always seemed to hold more than it revealed. "Thor, what did you do, boy? How did you know I needed to see this?" The boy seemed increasingly at ease beside Santiago. He moved a bit closer, as if finding comfort in the old man's presence. "Do you know who this collar belongs to?" the boy asked, looking at Santiago with curiosity. The question caught Santiago off guard. He took a deep breath and replied, his voice thick with emotion, "It belonged to my son's dog. He passed away many years ago." The boy was silent, processing the response, but he didn't seem scared or sad. Instead, he simply looked at Thor, as if he instinctively understood that everything was somehow connected. Santiago, for his part, felt something different within himself. It wasn't sadness or doubt. It was as if he were in the right place, at the right time, even without fully understanding what it all meant. The feeling was clear, something greater was at play. Thor had brought Santiago here, to the boy and to that collar, but the reason was yet to be revealed. There was more to uncover, and Santiago knew he had to be ready for whatever came next. Santiago felt that something much bigger was happening, something he couldn't yet comprehend. The boy, Thor, Max's collar, everything seemed interconnected in a way that defied logical explanation. He looked at the boy sitting beside him, knees pulled up and hands clutching the collar, and felt a strange connection, almost as if he had known the child for a long time. The silence was broken by the boy's quiet voice. It was like he knew where to go. "The dog. I only followed him because I felt safe. I was scared, but he didn't leave me alone." The boy's words hit Santiago like a wave of emotion. He knew that feeling well. Thor had done the same for him. Thor was more than a dog. It was as if he knew exactly what each person needed at the right moment. Clara, who had been silently listening to the conversation, gently chimed in. "We haven't been able to figure out where he came from, but he seems very attached to this collar. When we found him, he was hugging it as if it were his only protection." Santiago nodded, trying to piece everything together. "And what did he say about his family?" he asked. Clara sighed. "He doesn't remember. He just says he was wandering around, got lost, and the dog appeared." The boy, still holding the collar, looked at Santiago and asked a question that caught him off guard. "Do you think the owner of this collar is still out there?" Santiago felt a lump in his throat. How could he explain to the boy that the person who mattered most to him was no longer in this world? Carefully, he replied, "No, the owner of this collar has been gone for a long time. He was my son." The boy was silent for a moment, as if absorbing the words. "He must have been a good person," he said softly, looking at Thor, "because the dog wouldn't stop taking me to safe places. Like he wanted to protect me too." Santiago didn't know what to say. He felt a mix of sadness and gratitude. Sadness for all he had lost, but gratitude for being there, in that moment, beside the boy and Thor, as if destiny had orchestrated this encounter. Thor, who had been lying calmly, raised his head and approached, placing his paw on Santiago's lap. It was as if the dog wanted to comfort him, reminding him that he wasn't alone. The boy also moved closer, as if seeking the same sense of security. Santiago placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, and for the first time in years, he felt that perhaps there was something more waiting for him beyond loneliness. At that moment, he realized that Thor hadn't just brought back the collar, he had brought a new chance. A chance to start over, to care for someone who needed him just as much as he needed Thor. And, somehow, he felt that this was also part of his son's legacy. Santiago knew there were still unanswered questions, but at that moment he chose to focus on what was in front of him. He looked at the boy and said, "We'll figure this out, okay? You're not alone anymore." The boy gave a shy but relieved smile. Thor, sitting beside them, wagged his tail as if he knew everything was exactly as it should be. Santiago looked at the boy and at Thor, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. This encounter, which had seemed full of coincidences, now made sense. Thor hadn't just come home, he had guided Santiago to something that would completely change his life. The lost boy needed help, and Santiago realized that he needed the boy just as much as the boy needed him. Over the next few days, as authorities worked to locate the boy's family, Santiago found himself growing closer to the child. The nights were no longer as silent. Now, he heard a child's voice asking simple questions like, "What are we eating tomorrow?" or "Has Thor always been this smart?" Santiago realized he was smiling more, and his house felt fuller, more alive. As time went on, it became clear that the boy's family wouldn't be found anytime soon. Clara explained that he didn't have clear records and would likely need a temporary home. That's when Santiago made a decision he never thought he'd make again. "I want to take care of him," he said firmly. Clara, surprised, asked, "Are you sure? He'll need a lot of attention, and you already have Thor to look after." Santiago smiled gently. "Thor already taught me that I'm more capable than I thought. And this boy, I think he was sent to me." Gradually, Santiago's home life completely transformed. The boy, once shy and scared, began to open up. He ran around the yard with Thor, laughing loudly, while Santiago watched them with a mix of joy and nostalgia. Max's collar, which had once been a painful reminder, now seemed like a symbol of hope. It was as if Santiago's son had, in some way, sent him a message: there's still room for love and care in your life. One day, while they were walking through the neighborhood, the boy held Santiago's hand and asked, "Can I call you Grandpa?" The question caught Santiago by surprise, and he paused for a moment, feeling the weight of the emotion. He looked at the boy, then at Thor beside them, and replied with a smile, "Of course you can, son. Of course you can." From that day forward, Santiago never felt lonely again. The house, once so full of silence, became a place of laughter, play, and, above all, love. Thor remained by their side, loyal and attentive, as if his mission was to keep this new family united. Santiago knew that life wouldn't be easy and that challenges would come, but now he had something to motivate him every day. Thor had done more than bring back a collar. He had brought a second chance, a new family, and a reason for Santiago to keep going. And in that moment, Santiago understood that sometimes life's greatest gifts come in ways we never expect. Thank you for watching the video until the end. Remember to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts about this story in the comments below.